Company owners, employers, and other executives find themselves with a weighty responsibility. That is, trying to keep their business running smoothly and profitably. They have to choose the right people to make this goal attainable. So the interview and hiring process is one of great importance. One many employers choose to handle themselves. They don't want to delegate that to someone else. As time goes on, this process may almost become routine as many different applicants come and go. Now, some applicants may make an impression right off the bat, whether positive or not so much, but those ones are hard to forget. Others, well, maybe even 10 minutes after the interview, the one who conducted the interview is like, well, who was it that I just had here a few minutes ago? They're not very memorable. But then comes an applicant that is seemingly well qualified for the position, who has all the tools to be a success in their company. The application seems almost too good to be true, and then the interviewer can hardly contain his or her excitement as they look over the application. Oh wow, this is perfect. Oh, they're deaf. Well, now what do we do? Hi. I'm Earl Harden, and I'm an interpreter at the Betty and Leonard Phillips Deaf Action Center here in Shreveport, Louisiana. Hopefully, I'll be able to help you answer that cliffhanger of a question. Now, you know, it's rather strange that, in a way, business people who have years of experience dealing with people of all sorts of backgrounds and cultures, and who've learned to mitigate various situations involving differences, are seemingly stymied when it comes to dealing with people with hearing loss. Sometimes it's as though all the experience and training fail them at the moment when it could possibly do them the most good. But sometimes that's completely understandable. After all, it's not every day that the average person encounters a deaf or hard of hearing person, or at least not one that uses sign language as their primary means of communication. So when presented with that very situation, it's almost as if some people lock up mentally. They lose all concept of what they're supposed to do. Well, here's a little tidbit that may help you if you ever find yourself in that situation. Just remember, deaf people can do everything that people who hear can, except hear. Remembering that some measure of hearing loss is the one thing that separates them from the majority of people in their respective areas helps to calm some down, so to speak, and allows them to focus on ways to shore up the bridge of communication between those with hearing loss and those who can hear. While we're speaking about communication, you know, that's actually the #1 priority to focus on when it comes to interviewing a deaf individual. After all, how can you communicate effectively so that the most memorable thing about that job interview is the candidate himself or herself and the qualifications that they possess? Well, first of all, you need to ascertain the needs of the individual who is being interviewed. Depending on the level of hearing loss and how long it's been present, different means of communication may be utilized, perhaps along with an accommodation to provide equal access. Now, speaking of equal access, if you'd like more information about reasonable accommodations and your responsibility toward those with disabilities, please view another in our series of videos. This one in particular is entitled Legal Guidelines for Your Deaf Employees. But for the purpose of this video, and to simplify things, let's just assume that the deaf individual that you'll be interviewing primarily uses sign language to communicate. Assuming that you have little to no working knowledge of sign language, it will be necessary to hire an interpreter if you hope to have a reasonable chance to communicate effectively. Failure to do so will usually result in futility. That is, you'll be spending more time repeating yourself, writing notes that may or may not be easily understood by the applicant, and you might find yourself becoming frustrated at a process that ordinarily should be as seamless as it would for an individual who speaks your language and can hear and understand your words clearly. That frustration could lead to your deciding that hiring a deaf person, no matter how skilled they may be, it's just not worth the time and the effort that may be involved. And in so doing, that may cause you to miss out on a potentially wonderful employee who would be an asset to your company. If you'd like more information on why considering a person with hearing loss for your available position is possibly beneficial, please see our video entitled Advantages of Hiring Deaf Employees. Now, the first step in getting or obtaining an interpreter is to check your local interpreting agencies to find out about their availability for the date and time of your interview. Usually, the earlier you call, the better your chances of securing an interpreter at the time that you prefer, rather than having to reschedule. Once an appointment has been confirmed and you have an interpreter scheduled, please, if at all possible, inform the deaf applicant of that fact as well, because that way it helps to put them at ease. You see, many deaf and hard of hearing people deal with a measure of anxiety before heading to appointments because they, although having made it known that they're deaf and they need an interpreter, sometimes don't know for sure if there's actually going to be an interpreter at their interview or at their appointment until they get there. So if they know for a certainty before they arrive that the interpreter will indeed be there, well, that can allay some of their concern, and then it helps them focus on the normal anxiety of the interview. That is, how they're going to answer the questions, how they're going to present themselves, and not simply wondering about how we're going to understand each other. If you by chance have not worked with a sign language interpreter before and you need to know what to expect when one does come to the job site, please refer to our other video. And yes, we have several. This one's entitled Working with Interpreters, and that one will give you more details on what you can do. Now, once the interpreter has been scheduled, most of the hard work has been done. You know, for the most part, now you can proceed with preparing for this interview just as you would any other. However, there are some things about members of the deaf community and their culture that may require a few slight changes to your approach to this particular interview. One such fact is that the deaf community is heavily story-based. That is, they pass along their rich history and experiences through what really amounts to storytelling. They tend to build intricate pictures of events with their hands and facial expressions, which a skilled interpreter will have no problem interpreting into your language so that you will get it. But deaf people also tend to give a great deal of background information as a way of setting up these stories. So sometimes a simple question from your perspective, like you think it's simple, is, well, what brings you here today? Well, that can start them off on a retelling of when and where they were born, the members of their family, their educational history, work experience, and so on. Usually, when that happens, as a cultural mediator, the interpreter, without editing your message, can bring the focus back to the now. That is, the reason why the person is applying for this job on this particular day. But now that you kind of have some insight into the way that many deaf people think, it might give you the opportunity to think about the questions you plan to ask and make them as direct and specific as possible so as to get the desired answer. No, you're not dealing with anybody who has limited understanding or is in some way mentally incapable. No, that's not the case at all. But you are attempting to bridge two completely different languages and cultures. So the effort you put into simplifying your output will greatly enhance the possibility that what you receive in return will be more in line with what you would expect from someone who speaks your language natively. Now, another factor to keep in mind, and this is covered briefly in that video that we talked about working with interpreters, is that though we are customarily trained to look at the individual who is speaking to us, and in this case it would be the interpreter, when we're communicating with deaf people, we do well to look directly at them, even though the voice will usually not be coming from them. And I say usually because there are some deaf people who, though they use an interpreter, will choose to and prefer to voice for themselves. But when conducting the interview, address your questions and responses directly to them, that is the deaf applicant, and please do not refer to them in the third person, as if you were talking directly to the interpreter. In other words, ask him how long he worked for the city, or find out why she feels qualified for this position. Don't do that. Directly your questions to the applicant themselves. Now, whereas speaking a little bit slower than normal, or what you're accustomed to, may help the interpreter formulate their thoughts when producing the message in sign language, it's not necessary to slow down just for that reason. Also not necessary is stopping between every few words and then checking with the interpreter to make sure that they've got the message, as you would do in the case of using a voice interpreter. If you do this with a sign language interpreter, it actually hampers your message. It fragments and it makes it more difficult to interpret and to understand. Actually, to the extent possible, just speak in your normal manner, your usual speed, and everything should be fine. If the interpreter by chance needs to have you repeat something or they need you to slow down, they'll let you know then. Also, and this might be a little more common than you might think, when looking directly at the deaf person, there is no need to speak loudly and over-exaggerate your enunciation, as if that's going to help them understand your message any more than having the interpreter present would do. As long as the interpreter can hear you, everything should be just fine. Another point you might want to consider, even before the interview, is that the possibility of reasonable accommodations in the workplace is real, and it may be very likely, depending on the needs of the applicant. Now, if you've already hired an interpreter for the interview, well, commendably, you already are aware of the need for some accommodation. But remember, we're comparing an interview, which sometimes lasts several minutes to less than an hour, and day-to-day interactions on a job that's ongoing. Those are two totally different things. And that day-to-day job may require vastly different and greater investments of time and company resources than you might have thought of before. Now, it's highly unlikely that after the initial orientation and training period that you'll need an interpreter to come by every day or several times a week. But based on the needs of your deaf employee or your potential deaf employee, there may be a need for recurring interpreter hirings, that is, for team meetings, safety meetings, or other regular work functions where generous amounts of information will be divulged and discussed. Or if your prospective employee will need some form of phone communication, a specialized audio phone, whether it displays captions, whether it amplifies the voices in it, or even a video phone where the deaf person can sign to an interpreter, may be something that they request at the time of the interview. Familiarizing yourself with the ADA, that is the Americans with Disabilities Act, in advance will help you to anticipate and possibly be ready to make the needed adjustments in the event that you end up hiring the deaf applicant. Also, knowing in advance what sort of things may be requested or needed may also assist in budgeting for such things well in advance. Doing so may change the common perception of accommodations as just a burden. Actually, it may change your viewpoint to something of an investment. That is, you are preparing your prospective deaf employee to be a success in your company. In time, what you put into providing equal access for them may be rewarded with a contented, productive employee who shows their gratitude for having their needs met by then pouring themselves into their work, which they are now adequately qualified to do, and thus it justifies your initial investment of time and resources. So, by being aware of reasonable accommodations and the ADA, hopefully nothing brought up in the interview will catch you off guard, so to speak. Yes, interviewing candidates for your open position at your company is a heavy responsibility, as it holds the key to determining what type of employees you will be depending on for the foreseeable future. Being mentally prepared to interview a deaf or hard of hearing candidate takes some work, obviously, but doing so can open you and your company up to a mostly untapped pool of potential employees that just may be able to keep your business going profitably for many years to come. Again, I want to thank you for taking the time to view this special program. I hope that you found it useful and you will take its message to heart. Thank you.